Kia ora. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Tech Bites. Really pleased to be speaking today with Paul Littlefair, who I've known for quite a while. But why don't you introduce yourself, what your hometown is, what it was like growing up there, and what you do today, Paul?
Cool. Well, thanks, Craig, and kia ora toto. Nai mai, haere mai. Welcome, everybody. And yeah, real privilege to be here talking with you all. So thank you so much, Craig. Really appreciate the opportunity to join Tech Bytes today. So yeah, ko Paul Littlefair toko ingoa. I'm Paul Littlefair. I'm the Chief Digital and Technology Officer at Kiwibank. And yeah, a lot of people ask me the question, tell me a little bit about where you grew up and where your hometown is. Unfortunately for me, it's a little complicated, so I'll try and be brief. My father was an expat working in telecommunications, so I actually grew up in several places: the Caribbean, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and actually a little bit of the UK, as you will tell from my accent. My parents are English, but I wasn't born there. I think probably if I did describe my hometown, probably one of the places that had the biggest impact on me growing up was Hong Kong. Very dynamic, lots of energy, and while clearly a big Chinese population in Hong Kong, it's still very multicultural as a city. And I was there from the late 70s through the early 80s, and there was a huge social divide in Hong Kong, and with everybody packed in so tightly, I don't know if people watching this have been, but it's a great place, but very, very densely populated and everyone's packed in. You can really see the social divide, right? You can see the poverty. It's right there in front of you: beggars, homeless people, people living on the street genuinely with nothing. And there isn't a lot of social security in Asia. So those people who are poor, really definitely struggle. And they're right up against all the millionaires, luxury hotels, and there's some real money in Hong Kong as well, right? There's some really ultra wealthy people, and so I think for me it really made me appreciate the privilege that I have. I'm very fortunate. I've been born in to a good family, been given lots of opportunities, etc. And you don't have a choice into where you're born, and clearly some people have it very easy, and I think one of the big challenges we have these days with social media and these influences is you have these people who have been bought into affluence and an easy life and show you themselves going around luxury resorts and having all the fine thing that life offers, and there are other people in this world who have it very, very tough. And I'm thinking about, the things that are breaking out around the world at the moment. Obviously, the war in the Middle East is very current as we record this Tech Bites this morning. And, and some people have it very tough that, people will have not chosen to be to be living in that part of the world, under that kind of regime, and suddenly, places are exploding around you. But I think what it made me realize is that you do have choices to make in life. Some situations are difficult to navigate, and you'll make mistakes. And I do believe in OBE, which is overwhelmed by events. And so there are a lot of things outside of your control. So sometimes you can't choose. You happen to be walking down a street in Lebanon and the building next to you explodes. I mean, that's not something you can do something about, and it can overtake you. But I often think that people do have more control in life than they think. And I think a lot of my upbringing kind of helped me do that. And I think it's what's given me some of the determination and willpower that it takes occasionally when you have to make choices about how you move forwards through life. But determination and willpower can often be hard to sustain. I know when that extra drink's being offered on a Friday night, or someone brings out a plate of hot chips, and the willpower says, really, Paul, your weight's where it needs to be. You don't need them, and sometimes it's kind of hard to sustain these sorts of things. But yeah, and as I say, I had a very privileged upbringing and very fortunate, the start that I had in life.
Cool. Now, you moved from the UK. You were based there back to Aotearoa back in 1998. And what was it about New Zealand? I'll be a bit more specific. The New Zealand tech landscape that captured your interest then, and how has that Kiwi way of doing tech influenced your leadership style over what is it, 25 years now?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, when I dated my Kiwi girlfriend in London in the 90s, who's now my wife, fortunately, I ended up with this sort of wider peer group of Kiwis. And yeah, there was the normal sort of mix. There were generally quite a sporty bunch, I have to say, but there was a mix of accountants and and IT people and operations people, etc. And certainly the tech people I knew when I said to them, look. Carolyn and I have decided to move to New Zealand. They looked at me incredulously, and to be very transparent with you, the sort of phrase career suicide was sort of bandied around. But these were people who had come out of New Zealand, gone to London to do their OE, and were being very successful and making lots of money, having a really good time, off camper vanning around Europe every 5 minutes. It seemed to be the sort of Kiwi lifestyle in the mid to late 90s, in Europe. And so, yeah, when I moved to NZ, I probably came over with actually very low expectations because, all these people have said, no, if you want a good tech career, you should be in London like we are. We've kind of escaped and we've traveled halfway around the world to get here. And so I kind of came in thinking, oh, gee, am I going to find a job? Is it going to be interesting? How long will I land in New Zealand for? And I have to say, when I arrived, I was absolutely blown away. In some respects, it is great to sort of come in with low expectations because everything is then generally positive coming up. But while London was busy, and in '98 it was all about Y2K. I don't know if you remember back to those days, but we were all concerned that the tech was going to bring the planet to an end in the flip over between 1999 and the year 2000. Coming into New Zealand. I was really impressed. The banking here was streets ahead of anything that I'd seen in the UK. Rod Drury was busy at Glazier and other places, but there were lots of companies, doing interesting things on the internet, a number of Kiwi products being designed. And when I got lined up in front of companies to have job interviews, there were lots of companies that wanted to talk to me, just absolutely fascinating the stuff that's gone on. I do think that probably New Zealand has lost its way a little bit. I mean, we do have some great innovations. Xero is obviously, one of the big poster child companies that's been successful. And it's not the only one. There's been lots of other really good things. But, I'm in financial services in banking. And, now when I compare New Zealand to Australia, the UK, others, we're not the leader that we were, back in the 90s. This FPOS thing that was done was really revolutionary, but the rest of the world sort of caught up and probably surpassed us. And so I'm really keen that we try and capture that sort of innovative spirit sort of moving forwards. I feel that we've lost that a little bit.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a bit because you've got quite a background in banking. You've ended up sort of doing banking stuff.
Yeah.
And we often think of banks as being slow-moving tankers, So how do you maintain that challenger agility in an industry that's like really heavily regulated and quite foundational to our economy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I mean, the challenge with banks and financial services is, while there is the opportunity to look at a degree of innovation, the thing is that at the end of the day, we are trusted with people's money and people's financial well-being. And even with the regulation, that is not something that we take lightly in any bank that I've worked at. And so, when you think about banks, probably first of all, you think about, trust. I need someone that I can trust will keep my money safe and secure. But very quickly, you then think about precision. right? So, who do you trust to add numbers up? A bank, right? If your bank can't add the numbers up, you're very worried about them very, very quickly. And so, in some respects, sometimes, the opportunity to not make mistakes is almost adverse to the opportunity around innovation, because often when you're trying something new, you need that ability to make a mistake and pivot, rectify it, move forwards, sort of quickly. And when I look at new things that are emerging, I remember when Uber first came out, often it would get things wrong, and it was, somewhat frustrating. I mean, the good thing is that they pivoted and they kind of got it fixed. But, a bank trying something out and getting your balance wrong, or not moving your payment when you're standing in the supermarket queue, or trying to buy a coffee or whatever, is hugely embarrassing, and you get very fundamentally frustrated, right? Not settling your house correctly, right? You're going through a big emotional purchase in buying a house, and we're very aware that when these settlement amounts come through, your lawyers, that they have to hit, they have to be accurate, and so I do think that does inhibit the organisations a little bit around that space. But what I'd also say is I think the financial landscape is also pretty dynamic and fast moving, and not always in a positive way. I mean, just recently, the stuff that's been going on with frauds and scams, the speed that we have to respond now to what's going on. These criminal networks are very well funded. They're only focused on kind of one thing. Actually, if they get it wrong, it's not really a problem. They just then go to the next, they target the next, potential victim and move forwards. And so they're very agile, well funded, and we've been seeing a lot of these challenges in frauds and scams. And so that's an area where we've had to be very agile and dynamic. And the good news is that we have been making excellent progress in that space. I think the organisations have been doing well, although people are always frustrated and think we've been slow to respond. Just kind of keeping our head above water in that particular space has been somewhat difficult.
Yeah. Now you've ended up at Kiwibank. Well, should I say back at Kiwibank?
I can
see it. Yeah. and they have this this mission around helping Kiwi to be better off. So in a digital sense, how does your digital or your technology strategy, directly contribute to that social purpose beyond just having a shiny app, which everybody has, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think it's one of the great things about Kiwibank is our purpose of Kiwi making Kiwi better off, and leading a technology team here. People normally geek out around the ones and zeros, but you really see people turning up to work here with a spring in their step, because people are really buying into this into this vision. To specifically ask your question, Kiwi making Kiwi better off, I think for financial services, most of the time, banks just need to work. And the more we can just work so people don't have to think about us, the better. For our transactional lives, right? And so a lot of that is in that sort of payment space. Has my salary come in? Have I received? Craig owes me $50 from when we had beers last week. Has that turned up? And then also when I go to the supermarket, can I just swipe and go and make the payment quickly and just get on with my life? And so so for me, it's about how do we make those transactional experiences as frictionless and easy as possible. And the apps play a part in that, but it's also the payment rails, making sure that all the interchange and settlement systems and all the other bits and pieces that sort of move money around, and keeping you appraised, so when you want to have information. It's readily available at your fingertips 24/7. And I think that's the big thing that's sort of changed in banking. I mean, I certainly remember opening my first bank account in the UK, and if I wanted to know my balance, I either had to wait for my monthly statement to arrive, or I had to go into my local branch. Even if I was in a different town, I think they charged me £5 to phone my local branch to tell me how much money. And I do remember ATMs coming out. I mean, I'm generally that old, and suddenly you could go to an ATM and actually find out your bank balance. But otherwise, you had to write it down in your checkbook. Every time you wrote a check out, you had to write the number down and subtract it, so that you were kind of keeping sort of tabs on that. So I think for Kiwibank and Kiwi Better Off, it's about that frictionless piece. The other big piece of financial services, though, is there are some big life events, right? I've already talked about buying a house. That's a significant life event, or I'm hooking up with a partner, and I'm deciding to run your finances together, having joint accounts, taking student loan out to go to university, planning for your retirement, and how are you going to manage family wealth and those sorts of things. And so, I also think making Kiwi Better Off is really how we show up, in those sorts of things. I have a dream. I want to open a business. Great. How do we, also make that frictionless, right? And how do we, make sure that, we have those relationship moments with you when you need advice, when you're looking at your options, when you need somebody just to walk by your side, educate and support and assist you, and help you basically move forwards. And that's really where I think financial services become that economic underpinning, because often it's just around sort of providing these services, but often it is about, when people are making life choices. And I still don't think there's enough financial literacy through schools. I don't know about you, Craig, but I was never taught about mortgages or home loans when I went to school. Read a lot of Shakespeare and other things, but not taught about how to manage for my retirement, what KiwiSaver was about, how financial markets worked, and those kinds of things. I think kids are becoming a lot more financially literate, although I'm still very worried in this digital age that so much information is sourced through TikTok and through influencers who some of them are great, don't get me wrong. There are some amazing financial advisors who publish content on YouTube, etc. But there's also, it's a real minefield out there. And so, one of the other things I think we do as making Kiwi Better Off is, we do a lot of work with schools through our program. We're partnered with Banker, and we're doing a lot of education in that space as well. So, I think those are really the key things.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, that $50 will be in your bank next week. Which is interesting, because I'm leading on to the next question, which I want to talk to you about, which is quite important to me, which is that you've recently stepped into the role of the chair of the board of TUANZ, as we hit this big 40 years. So, and you and I are both, I remember queuing up in the bank on a Friday afternoon to cash a check to get for cash for the weekend so I can go out and party. But look, looking back at 1986 versus 2026, the tech has really changed, but the need for a user voice, well, my perspective, hasn't. So what's your primary vision for us as an association as we navigate this anniversary year?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the need for a user voice has probably increased, to be blunt, because there's more technology, in every part of our lives, and not just our lives, but our children's lives, and also, for people my age, I also support a whole bunch of an elderly network, i.e. my parents and my parents' friends, who also want somebody to help them, set up all their tech and do all those other things as well. And so, there is so much technology now, and sometimes I'm a tech guy. I do love the ones and zeros. I genuinely understand how ADSL actually works, and what goes on when internet comes into your house and those sorts of things. I understand IP addresses and subnet masks and all that stuff. And sometimes I struggle to set up people's networks, even with the wealth of knowledge I have. And so I think about your average Kiwi. And this needing wireless internet at home and needing a Wi-Fi at home, and yet so much complexity sits underneath it that people are expected to deal with. And I do think, things have improved. I think of the early days, when we all had dial-up networking at home and, those things and the lovely noises those routers they used to make, that are now appearing in movies and stuff. But, I'm still amazed, that so many people are able to actually make, the technology work. And so, I think the need for a user voice is bigger than it has ever been. And in some respects, we run a capitalist market here in New Zealand. So in some areas you get to vote with your feet, right? And so, to be blunt, I hope Kiwibank gives excellent service, for all our customers out there. I hope we do a really good job looking after you. But if you decide that we don't, you have the opportunity, you have choice. You can go somewhere else, but there are also so many areas where you don't have choice, right? And what do we do in that particular space, right? And I think when we look at things like what happens with social media and how these large tech companies are moving forwards and some of the societal issues of technology in 2026. There isn't a choice. And so who is speaking for the user community when there isn't a choice? How are we making sure that as a user community, we're not just dictated to because, the alternative is just opt out, right? That's the choice you're given, opt in or opt out. And that's not really a choice. Right. And so, my view is that, TUANZ is absolutely critical to represent the voice of users in New Zealand, who feel that in some areas we should be doing better. We absolutely. And how are we holding those people in power to account? Because you don't have the choice of walking away and finding a different outcome or a different provider. And so that's, you talked about what's my primary vision for the association. Look, I think TUANZ has always been a strong voice. I think one of the things, though, is that TUANZ had a lot of success from its roots in telecommunications. And telco is still a very big part because, technology relies on being connected, right? And the minute your phone doesn't work, or you lose your Wi-Fi or whatever, even though you now have technology, the minute it's not connected these days, it's really hard to make it work, and so and still so the underlying comms rails are still very key, and so I think TUANZ is very well placed given its background in that space. But I was delighted when TUANZ said no, we need to move onwards from just telecommunications, and we need to be the technology user association. We need to expand our envelope. The umbrella needs to be a little bigger and a little wider as we look, more broadly. And so, I think TUANZ that my primary vision is how do we take that mantle now of being the technology user association of New Zealand, and how do we make that work for Kiwis?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of those technology issues, that's all around us at the moment, which is this pervasive generative AI that's coming through. So like at Kiwibank, you're dealing with high stakes data, and as part of TUANZ, we're advocating for responsible use. So you're buying into that as well. But what does this responsible and inclusive AI look like in practice for you? And is it about the algorithm, the way we use it, or the people behind it? How does it fit with you?
Yeah, it's look, it's a fascinating topic, and I'll try and give you some appropriate sound bites and not waffle on too long, because there's all sorts of nuances in this AI space. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that that AI is really outside of New Zealand, right? I mean, we don't have a New Zealand AI solution, and to be blunt, I don't think we will do. I was talking yesterday with people, and I do think there are some areas like Te Reo Māori, for example, where New Zealand really should be saying, well, no, that is part of the heritage of Aotearoa of the country here. I want to be clear as a Pākehā, it's not really my probably place to talk about it, and we do have some real leading experts in this space. Take at University of Waikato, is doing a lot in here, and there are others in this space. But I do think there's an opportunity there. But when you look at the sheer compute power, I go back to the ones and zeros that you need to run, these broad large language models. While we have sustainable green power here, I'm not sure we have the budget to spend all the money with NVIDIA that they would expect to build the data centers to run a Kiwi equivalent of a ChatGPT or a Claude or whatever. So while I think there are some specialist niches that New Zealand can come in and should look to take some degree of ownership around, just the sheer requirements that it takes. And so I think we are going to be stuck in a world where we are consuming AI from these large tech giants, whether they're based in the US or potentially in Europe. We're seeing stuff starting to happen in Europe, or I've recently been around Southeast Asia, and what I was quite surprised to see is there's a number of countries in Southeast Asia who somewhat can be critical of what China's doing, but they were all using DeepSeek. To be blunt, they trusted the DeepSeek LLMs more than they trusted the US ones. And so I would say New Zealand, we're still probably wedded more to stuff coming out of North America, but there is going to be this capability elsewhere. And so then you're kind of in the situation, you're saying, well, how are these companies then making decisions about how they respect IP, copyright? Lots of stuff going on in the movie and the music world at the moment. Some great AI systems that can create brilliant songs, and I'm told something like 40% of new artists on Spotify now, they reckon, are being AI generated. I don't know whether that number's accurate or not. It's just a soundbite that I heard quoted. But of course, that's all based off AI models that have been trained on somebody else's intellectual property, right? And the crawl that the LLM did for its training was using material that maybe wasn't appropriate. And so there are legal cases going through in the US at the moment about how these things are particularly trained. But I mean, the only other thing I would say is that I think some of this argument about how AI uses our data, in some respects, the horse has already bolted, because I think social media has already come in and driven that. And someone mentioned to me the other day, the irony of people arguing on Facebook about data privacy. Because you've already given all your information to a company that's actually, if you read their terms and conditions, very clear that any material you share with them becomes their property, and they're allowed to do with it as they please. And so I think it's a very difficult area to navigate going forwards. The one thing I would say though is, we can't put our heads in the sand and ignore it and say, because there are concerns about AI and how it uses data and how it is responsible and inclusive, that we should then, as a country, not use it, because I also think that will be significantly to our disadvantage. And so, the challenge is, how do you navigate through that as best you can? And it comes back to governance, good guardrails, good data policy, and those sorts of things. And once again, while I think organizations are normally quite good at that, I think our user community gives away far, far too much information. And I think, once again, that's where someone like TUANZ can step in and help and say, well, actually, how would we create some guardrails around New Zealand?
Just moving on to some of the other things that we're doing. So, you've been a vocal supporter of our Flint and our Next Gen Leaders program and that building talent. So why is building the human side of the tech ecosystem so important to you, and how do we bridge that talent gap?
Yeah, so I think despite AI, I think humans will always need humans. I have a fundamental belief in that, and I quite often talk to you know, young leaders about technology, and they ask me what I do in my job, and I say, I basically spend my time looking after human beings, because while you might think I spend my time working with computers, it's still always about the people. And I think even in an AI world, it's still going to be about the people. AI is going to do a lot more automation. We already saw it. Manufacturing is a good example. Robots in factories. My grandfather used to work in car manufacturing in the UK in a production line, and he's not with us anymore. But I can tell you now, his job is also not here anymore. The robots are doing the welds on the cars coming down the production line. The reason that got put in a while ago is because the amount of exceptions is very minimal. The robot just puts the same weld in the same place, because the same piece of metal just turns up in front of it every X number of seconds, and it does the weld. It's never asked to think about outer boundary conditions or something being a bit different, or those sorts of things. It's a highly repeatable process with very little exceptions. I think the difference that generative AI has now brought is that it's now coming into processes where there are some exceptions, or there is a degree of variability. And because generative AI is now probabilistic rather than deterministic, which is kind of the way old school IT worked and robots worked, and the way that they're trained, and it's all based around probabilities, it lends itself to a wealth more sort of automation. And so when I do talk to people coming into careers, and people around our Flint programs and next gen leadership, and and what skills do you want to develop, things that are very repeatable and very autonomous, probably not the best thing to be getting into. But AI is still not creative. It can do a good, analog of being creative. When you ask it to create a song, and but it's still only doing that based on the training that it's had. It doesn't have this concept of creating anything genuinely novel. It still needs a human being to sort of drive it and tune it. And AI is still really bad at judgment calls. And, this is why, kind of going back to, companies, I do like the fact that Anthropic, have put some very significant ethical guardrails in their system. And only last week there was a big falling out with the US Department of Defense, which was sort of well publicized, where they were saying, well, Anthropic is the only system that the US government has put into their sort of private classified information, and they were wanting Anthropic to drop some of their ethical guardrails, and Anthropic kind of refused. And the upshot is that the whole relationship basically broke down, and Anthropic are now being thrown out of the US government because they refused to do some things that they kind of didn't believe in. And that's because even Anthropic are saying that sometimes AI makes some excellent judgment calls, and sometimes it gets it horribly wrong. Some really good examples of AI. You tell it to please book me some seats at a restaurant. The next thing it's ringing up and cancelling other people's reservations, to make sure that you secure, your reservation at a restaurant that's already fully booked, because it can't make those judgment calls. And so we are always going to need people across those particular pieces. So I'm definitely an optimist. The world will change. The world always changes. There will be jobs that will be lost. There is no doubt about it. But that has already happened in a number of industries. and yet we're all still here and we all still move on.
Mm.
The people who used to, like my grandfather, weld cars, have had moved into, doing other things, kind of moving forwards. And so, and so I do think that there is big opportunity, and I think people will always need people. Even in the banking industry, I talked about those life decisions. Maybe some people will be happy talking to an AI advisor. Some people might be happy talking to an AI doctor. But I still think eventually that some people will say, no, I want to talk to a person.
Yeah. Look, as we get to the end of our conversation, you've worked across a number of banks, and I do remember, meeting you at LIC. That must have just been a little bit of a side hop out of the banking environment. But what's one surprising insight you've gained about that relationship between technology and the end user that might actually surprise people listening in?
Oh, so have I got any surprises about this particular thing? I think the surprise I would have is there's a couple of quotes that always resonated with me, and I'm sure people will have heard them before. The first one is that famous Wayne Gretzky quote, who was a fantastic ice hockey player in North America, and he famously said, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where the puck is going to be. That's a really kind of key one. And I think, organizations that are successful skate towards where the puck is going to be. And so, you do have to put yourself out there, and you do have to say, I'm going to make a judgment call about where the puck's going to be, because you can be wrong. And do that. And then to that end, there's also a very famous Bill Gates quote, which is, we totally overestimate the impact of new technologies in the next 2 years and totally underestimate the impact of new technologies in the next decade. And I still think that holds very, very true. Some new things break, you get some early adopters, they tell you the whole world is about to change, that you won't recognize everything in the next 3 months. And then everybody goes, no, it wasn't as big a deal as they made out. This new internet thing, this new mobile thing, this new AI thing, my life hasn't really changed that much. And yet 10 years later, it's very, very different. If you told me as a kid that, I wouldn't have to work my evening schedule around the TV schedule. If I wanted to watch the Muppet Show, I had to be, in front of the television at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, right? And my schedule was religiously set around, some of these things. And so, you got really into organization and planning. Now I just go and sit on YouTube and watch what I want, when I want, for the length of time that I want, and all under my kind of complete control. And my kids are not blown away by that, and I'm not really blown away by it anymore, because it just becomes normal. But if you literally told my kind of 12-year-old self that I would have had a remote control and I could have just turned on the show when I wanted to see it, I would have been incredulous, and we had to go through the whole video recording system and having we bought Betamax, of course, because we did, when we should have bought VHS. But the whole thing about, setting it up to record and going through that, and then there was the whole TiVo thing, and etc. And so I think probably, I don't know if that's a surprising insight for people, but I do think technology will continue and has changed the world. But I think that sometimes, people, when we turn up and say, hey, we need to be thinking about this in a different way, people go, oh, it's not as big a deal as we thought. And it's like, well, yeah, but over time, it really is going to be a big deal. When social media, when Facebook hit, it was all for the kids. They're all using something different now. But I do think social media has changed the world, and not always for the better. And I really think we missed that. I think, governments, parents, schools, everything around the world has missed some of the things that social media has changed in society. And I think that only now, groups are starting to try and reset on that particular piece.
Yeah. Hey, look, it's been great talking to you. Every time I talk to you, I learn new things and more about you too. So, look, to wrap up, this year, I'm always asking this recommendation. What are two books that you've read recently, tech focused or otherwise, that you think our listeners should pick up?
That's a really good question. I've got a couple. I'll try and be brief. I'm not good at being brief, but so the first one is actually one I've picked up multiple times, and I keep picking it up, and it's Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by Steve Covey, which is a pretty dated book these days. But every time I pick it up and I say to myself, am I doing all of these seven habits, and am I doing them to the best of my ability, and am I doing them every day? I always find myself wanting, and there's some really great habits in there. First things first, about prioritization and dealing really with what's important rather than what you would like to deal with, which is a big one for me. Sharpen the saw. I need to continue, and especially in the tech world, to keep ourselves up to speed in that particular place. And first of all, seek to understand, before you seek to be understood. And so, and there are plenty of others. I won't go through all seven, but it's a great book, and I'd certainly recommend it to everybody. It's pretty dated now, but I still find them very, very meaningful. And then something else is pure escapism. I've been reading Dungeon Crawler Carl. I don't know if you've come across this. It's a whole new genre of literature that I'd never really known about. Being a tech guy, as you can imagine, I'm pretty much into science fiction and some of that stuff. But there's a new genre called Lit RPG, which has really emerged from people writing books and self-publishing them online, and then getting feedback from the user communities, and they're sort of encouraging these authors. And some of these authors now have got such big sort of community fan bases online that then large-scale publishers like Macmillan and Penguin and others are taking note and actually doing that. So Dungeon Crawler Carl is now on Audible, and really well narrated audiobooks. And I actually noticed that they're now selling the paperbacks in Whitcoulls as well. So it's a very fanciful kind of story, and I won't necessarily say it will appeal to everyone. The books are by a guy called Matt Dinnerman, they're pure escapism and certainly a bit of fun and something a little bit different. So, you can type in Dungeon Crawler Carl on the internet and see what it's all about. So all good.
Awesome. Hey, look, it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to talk with you and to uncover some of this stuff around your background, but also around where we're going as an association as well as an organization. So thanks everybody for listening. This is going to be, well, you're obviously listening to it at the moment. It'll be on our YouTube channel or any of the podcast channels. If you want to listen to it, subscribe to it so that you get to hear the next episodes. We're up to 54, 55 now. So we're doing well. Anyway, thank you, Paul, and ka kite.
Not too long.